walking, biking, public transit. Welcome to another episode of On Transit. In this episode of On Transit, I visit the Railvolution conference in Chicago. In early November, I spent a week in Chicago to visit family living there and to attend the Railvolution conference. Railvolution is an annual conference dedicated to building livable communities based on transit. Transit agency workers, city planners, architects, citizen transit advocates like myself, and many other types of folks attended the conference. Over 1,000 people were at Railvolution, which was held at a hotel in Chicago's Magnificent Mile North Michigan Avenue district. The opening session featured speeches by the U.S. Secretary of Transportation, Mary Peters, the President of the American Public Transit Association, Bill Miller, U.S. Representative Earl Blumenauer from Portland, Oregon, and a lesson on the importance of rail on the development of the city of Chicago. Here are a few excerpts from those opening speeches.
This is a view of Chicago in 1874, and you can see that even by the middle of the 19th century, Chicago was completely wrapped and hemmed in by rails. From the north and northwest, the Chicago Northwestern. From the west, the Burlington. From the southwest, the Alton. And from the south, the Illinois Central. The rails literally wrapping the city up and tying it up in terms of its future development. Another thing that's interesting to think about, in 1870, Chicago's population was 300,000. 20 years later, it had grown 400%. So we're talking about the rails enabling a level of growth that it's very hard for us to understand in the 21st century. By 1857, not 1890, not 1900, by 1857, Chicago was the center of the largest rail network on Earth, with 3,000 miles of track and 100 trains a day entering and leaving the city by 1857. And the streetcars ran on a quarter sectional or half-mile grid. And that's important because when you went to work in the morning, you got in the streetcar. When you came home at night, you got off and you went to the greengrocer, you went to the tailor, you went to the shoe shop. And those commercial strips were along where the streetcars ran. And that is very much, continues to be a central character of Chicago today. The commercial strips of Chicago are on the quarter sectional streets, every half a mile, and then you would leave and go back into the neighborhoods where the homes were. Chicago's story is the story of a city shaped by rails. It's a story of a formal physical place shaped by rails, but it's also the story of a city whose culture, whose economics, whose social life, whose political life, whose institutional infrastructure was absolutely a result of rail and the presence of rail in this city.
Today, across America, our roads, airports, and transit systems are being choked by congestion in communities large and small across America. Now, Jim and I made a tactical error this morning when we landed at O'Hare Airport this morning and decided to come downtown here. We came in automobiles. And as we sat in the traffic, which took us, as Jim observed, very nearly as long as it took us to fly here to Chicago, we saw the train whizzing by. And we looked at one another and said, you know, we should have gotten on the train. But these tie-ups across our country are wasting energy. They are reducing air quality, and they're causing Americans to spend less time with their families and friends and less time productive on their jobs. It's time for all of us, public and private citizens alike, to stop accepting congestion as just a fact of life, as something we can't do anything about, as just another cost of business, because it does not have to be that way. With America's population and economy growing at a record pace, the Bush administration understands that rail and other transit services must play a role in shaping and sustaining the development of our communities and our nation. Just look at the success with the development around the Minneapolis-Hiawatha Light Rail line. The transit line has exceeded ridership expectations, and the line has proven to be a very powerful catalyst for denser development in the area. We have to work together to tackle the transportation challenges we face, and we must do that by finding fresh new ways to keep our transportation systems safe and to keep them strong.
Today is a Monday, today is a weekday. 33 million times today, Americans will board public transportation vehicles. And in fact, ridership is up this year. Last year it was up about 1.3%, over 9.7 billion times Americans used public transportation last year. That 1.3% may not sound like much growth, but for a mature industry like ours, That's hundreds of millions of more rides on public transportation. By the way, our friends in the highway business last year were only up by 0.1%. So I guess we're all good transit advocates. We grew 13 times faster. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, they still have this amount of trips, and we still have this amount of trips. But somewhere those two lines will cross if, in fact, we work together. And this year, the prospect of higher gas prices, among other things, has kept that growth going. We've seen in the first 6 months of this year, on average, about a 3.2% growth rate, led by light rail. You heard the Secretary speak of the phenomenal success in Minneapolis, and she could have listed quite a number of other places. Light rail this past year grew by, or these first 6 months of this year, grew by some 9.4%. Here in Chicago, the rail systems are growing quite nicely, thank you, faster than the national averages. The CTA up by over 4.5% in the 6 months of the first 6 months, and the Metro commuter rail by some 3.6%. But you know, lest you think that this is somehow just a blip on some kind of long-term trend that's related to gas prices, we have been growing for the last 10.5 years now. In fact, in the 10 years between 1995 and the end of 2005, we've seen a growth in transit usage of over 25%. 25%. By the way, our population grew by only 11% in that period. The nation's highway use as measured by BMT, only 22%. So it's not just higher gas prices that are making a difference. It is the fact that transit is better today, it is more available today, and as will be documented throughout this conference, the fact is that through transit-oriented development, millions and millions of more Americans are gaining ready access to public transit. Well, will this growth continue? There are some people who say, high gas prices was a blip. Yeah, there's been some transit growth, but that was just some pent-up demand, and it's not going to continue in the future. Well, there's lots of things that say that's not true. For example, this summer, the Pew Research Center, which asked those proverbial 1,000 Americans all those questions about what they think in their lives, every few years they ask about transportation. This was the year to ask about transportation. One of the questions they ask is your automobile something special? Now, they last asked that question in 1991. In 1991, when they asked that question, 43% of the respondents said, yeah, my auto is something special. This year, only 23% of the people said, yeah, my auto is something special. In 1991, when they were asked, is it a chore to drive? Only about 1 out of 5 people said, yeah, it's a chore to drive. When they asked it this year, it was almost 1 out of 3 people said, it's a chore to drive. Okay, so it's a chore to drive, big deal, so that's what they told you. Do they want change? Well, another study released earlier this year by the Harris poll, one of the things they asked about was, what do you want more of in the future? What do you want more of in the future? On the freight side, it was a no-brainer. 67% wanted more freight by rail. Only 25% wanted more freight by truck. On the passenger side, similar kind of trend. Now, as they always say, these numbers don't add to 100 because people could give multiple responses. 44% of Americans said they want more travel in the future by commuter rail. Some 35% said they want more travel in the future by intercity rail, high speed or not, by intercity rail. Some 23% wanted more travel by local bus. How many wanted more travel by car in the future? 11%. 11%. So not only is it more of a chore to drive my car, but because it's more of a chore, people are ahead of the politicians in many cases, and in fact, they want more choice. And that's what the Railvolution is about at its core. When you think about a new rail project today, and you think about what the critics said, how expensive that was, what will that look like 25 years from now, 50 years from now? 100 years from now, when people at a gathering like this are sitting around saying, gee, who was it who had that foresight to build that great rail line way back at the turn of the century when it was so cheap to do so? Ladies and gentlemen, you're part of that leadership, and don't let anyone talk you out of it.
What you are talking about at this conference, and what many of you are modeling in your community, is the key to our being able to, now, for those of you who think global warming is a myth, just cover your ears right now. But for those of you who think that the evidence is enough that maybe we ought to do something about it, what you're involved with is key to being able to make progress in the protection of the planet. For the economic revitalization, because regardless of what you hear about the average income, which is skyrocketing, and it still is, but it's doing so because of the top 0.1%. 90% of the population in your communities and mine are struggling or actually falling behind. And what you're about is a way to harness the forces of growth and development in a way that provide benefit, economic benefit, tangible economic benefit for the other 90%. You are about whether or not we're going to be able to make the communities work in a more functional way rather than just sort of battling to hold on. A sustainable future that will make things better. I think there's one other element that we're about, and that is the work that you are doing in building livable communities, in providing things on the ground. An example of the cooperation and the bringing people together that ultimately is going to heal the body politic. You're going to show politicians how to work together in ways that people expect government to perform. So I express my deep appreciation for your being here and committing the next 3 days to this important work. It's not just building your communities, it's saving us from global warming and saving politicians from themselves. Thank you very much.
In addition to the conventional conference workshops where you sit in the hotel conference rooms and listen to presenters, Railvolution featured several mobile workshops, which gave conference attendees a chance to ride transit to learn about it and its impact on communities. I attended 2 mobile workshops. The first mobile workshop I attended was called Neighborhoods, Art, and Transit, Cultural Excursions on the Pink Line. The Pink Line is a new Chicago transit service, an L line created by creatively putting together some existing service routes. We took a tour of public art along the route. We started in the Loop downtown at an elevated station.
My name is Amy Malik. I coordinate the Arts and Transit program at the Chicago Transit Authority. So we're going to be visiting a few of our recent installations along the Pink Line, which was formerly the Blue Line. And we opened the Pink Line service in June of this year, so it's very new to us. You'll notice that we didn't have a lot of signs pointing to the Pink Line when we came up into the station, because it's actually a 6-month experimental project to see how the community responses. We're tabulating survey results right now to see if we are going to keep it as a permanent service. The Blue Line used to actually go from O'Hare and then split off after it went through the loop onto 2 separate branches. O'Hare Airport is up here at the end of the Blue Line, and the Blue Line used to go down into the loop in a subway and then go back out and branch off at UIC station. So there was a Blue Line here and then also a Blue Line that went straight down and then out west where that dotted blue is. That used to be the Blue Line, 2 branches. What happened in June 2006, we disconnected the Cermak branch, which is the Pink Line now, from the Blue Line and routed the Pink Line straight up, connected it to the Green Line and ran it to Ashland Station and then into the loop in a clockwise direction and then straight back out. So it's its own separate service. And the reason that we separated the 2 services and now have a Pink Line is because we had a lot of frequent headways on the O'Hare branch of the Blue Line, but then when they separated out to go to the 2 separate neighborhoods, frequent service was not as frequent as people would want it to be. So
was it hourly or was
it was every 20 minutes? Yeah, and every 10 minutes during the peak, but it's not enough. One of the things that we did when we initiated the new service on the Pink Line was to hold a contest to find out what color it should be. It was an essay contest that we held in public schools, and we had people send in essays to describe what color and why they would like it to be that color. And we had a lot of responses, especially from girls who said that all of the subway colors were boy colors, so they wanted a girl color.
We rode the Pink Line train through the newly developing neighborhoods of the near west side, where warehouses are turning into loft housing.
The Pink Line runs on an elevated track and serves the West Loop, which used to not necessarily have as much transit as it transit, because as you'll see, there's a lot of development happening around here. We have a lot of loft development, a lot of new residential population. So this service allows more frequent service and rail access.
Then we turned south toward the campus of the University of Illinois, Chicago.
UIC has 25,000 students. We're on the west campus. There's also an east campus. We'll actually go through the Rush Hospital. The elevated line goes right through the hospital.
A Czech neighborhood, actually prior to that a German neighborhood, and it's gradually transitioned to primarily Mexican, Latino population, and now it's actually changing even more. Has a lot of artists, and the demographics are just rapidly changing here. There's a lot of really amazing historic architecture. So this station, 18th Street, was actually rebuilt a couple years ago, or a couple decades ago, and it's an accessible station. We're going to visit the Blue Line stations, which were rebuilt and reopened in 2004, the next stations that we'll see. So this is an older looking station compared to the ones that we're going to see in a few minutes. You'll also notice that we have a lot of artwork, which is not part of the Arts and Transit program, which is an actual capital project program that the CTA operates. This is an Adopt a Station program, which is a community-based initiative where we allow community organizations to come in and do artwork installations with, in this case, youth groups, and it was sponsored by the Mexican Fine Arts Center Museum, which we're about to visit as well. This was done several years ago, so it's in a little bit of need for touching up, but it's a great example of the way that we've involved communities in helping to beautify our stations. The Arts and Transit program and the Adopt a Station both allow for communities to really take ownership and pride in their CTA station. And they've really, obviously beautified the station tremendously. When you adopt a station, you're responsible for all the installation and maintenance costs of the installation. The Mexican Fine Arts Center Museum did adopt this station in the early 90s, and their adoption has since lapsed if this artwork weren't here.
Pilsen was named after Pilsen, P-L-Z-E-N, the fourth largest city in Czechoslovakia. And it was in the early 1800s that Czechs and many Eastern Europeans moved in this area. Just north of here, just northeast, is where Mrs. O'Leary had her barn where the cow kicked over the lantern. And luckily, the wind was blowing the other way, and it burned something like 16 square miles all the way from this area to the hotel where you're staying at. And this area here was untouched by the fire.
We walked a couple blocks in the Pilsen neighborhood to the Mexican Fine Arts Museum.
Late 1950s, early 1960s, it became more known as a Mexican-dominated community, but always known as a working-class neighborhood. I think it's home to the Chick-Chac style of mural. Chac refers to a place in Mexico where most of the prominent muralists came from, and Chick refers to Chicago style combined with that type of mural style.
The museum had a major exhibit about Day of the Dead, with examples of variations in the tradition across the breadth of Mexico.
This is an example of an ofrenda, an altar from the state of Michoacán, the central part of Mexico. As you can see, it's very different.
Images of death and images of cars brought to vivid light the tragic sight of North America's lopsided transportation system.
And he died in a car crash. He wasn't doing it.
From the Arts Center, we walk through neighborhoods where the original street level was one whole story below the current street. You could see this in so many yards, visible way below the sidewalk.
The panels that are selected to determine what artworks are commissioned come together and review many slides. Slides of artwork from hundreds of artists. And then they kind of winnow it down over the course of several meetings and then ultimately determine a handful of artists that they'd like to see develop site-specific proposals for the station that they're looking at. And our experience so far has been that the stations themselves are usually designed and in some cases, in this case, was actually completed before the artwork was installed. So it was slightly after the fact. It's something that we're trying to change, but it's sort of slow going. A lot of times construction schedules just don't allow us to achieve that level of coordination like we'd like to. One of the main reasons we love to install artwork is because it basically decorates the station and deters vandalism from happening. And as you see, the person who did the tagging did it in the blank slate area where his signature could be seen. So that's one of the unfortunate realities that we're sort of dealing with at this point. We typically try to put the artwork in locations where they're out of harm's way, but in some cases we just don't have the space for it. You'll notice that at the end here we have some of the historic canopies. These are the original canopies that were built for this station 100 years ago, and then the new canopies over here at the other end. There was an interest in preserving some of the historic assets that were in the infrastructure to begin with. So we had a few little nods to what the stations used to look like in the designs. It's an interesting little design feature.
Doors closing.
He's a painting muralist, and what he did was basically develop a full-scale painting and then lay his mosaic on top of it in his studio. Then you'll see also around the mosaic is this old terracotta piece. That actually used to be the facade of the station before it was reconstructed. And we initially had not planned to save the facade at all. We have another couple of these in our system that have been restored, so I guess the decision had initially been to just tear it down and start over and build this. But then some people thought that it was a significant enough asset to keep and to restore in some capacity. Although we didn't do a full-blown historic preservation type of project, we did preserve some of it and incorporated it into the artwork. Our ridership has really gone through the roof on this line. I mean, it dwindled off quite a bit before the reconstruction occurred. We also did not have weekend service on this line, which allowed us to reconstruct the branch without taking the line out of service. We did a lot of construction during the weekend and at night. So we never took the line out of service. We had temporary stations built while we did the construction work, but still ridership was down because it was just more inconvenient for a lot of people and the service was slow. So now since it's been rebuilt, our ridership is way up.
I like how the L trains in Chicago managed both to evoke strong images of history while also feeling quite modern or even futuristic. In the center of the city, the trains run on very old steel structures, but the cars themselves are as silver as the space age. Many of the stations and track out in the neighborhoods have been rebuilt over the last few years. The elevated tracks give you a privileged vision of the city. Part of the allure of Chicago must come from that L-viewed image of it. So many rooftops from the sawtoothed 1890s crescendoing into the skyscrapers of the 1960s downtown. And this trip, especially riding back to the city's center through the near west side, I saw so many brick warehouses newly polished up for condos. I had already seen and heard all this, and my first day at the Railvolution conference had not even ended.